As we come to our last lesson in our study of the book of 1 Samuel, it's lesson number 56, and we are beginning here in chapter number 31, the last chapter in the book of 1 Samuel. And as we come to this last chapter of this book, I want to tell you the compiler has inserted the Chronicles of Nathan, who remained with Saul at Gilboa, and he saw all this and he could tell us all this. And Nathan tells us the story of the final days of King Saul and the death of Saul here in chapter 31, verse number 1. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his son, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men on that day together. We learn of the deaths of the 3 sons of Saul. But Ishbosheth is not mentioned because he was not there. Why was he not there? Well, we're not told. I suspect he was in one of the Israelite camps across the valley or on the other side of the Jordan River, but we will discuss that in the next passage. Second, Saul was shot with an arrow and he was mortally wounded, but it would be a slow death. He knew he was going to die, but it's going to be a slow death. And as all his men with him on Gilboa were being killed around him, he did not want to be alive when the Philistines showed up and found him. They would have taunted him. They would have filled him with 1,000 cuts. Instead, he asked his armor-bearer, who probably took David's place, to kill him, but the armor-bearer refused. Therefore, Saul committed suicide. Now, when his armor-bearer saw what Saul did, his armor-bearer committed suicide. The armor-bearer was also the bodyguard of the king. So when he failed to do his job to protect Saul, his punishment would have been death. At least it would have been in Saul's reign. That's the way it would have happened. So he killed himself instead. Now from across the valley, in another camp of the Israelite army, they could surely see the progression of the Philistines on Mount Gilboa as they chased the Israelites. The Israelites surely retreated back to Gilboa because that was where their camp was and all their baggage. And surely the Israelites hoped in their retreat that they could retrieve their baggage and run for the hills. And many did escape. Someone reported to the other in the Israelite camps with the knowledge of Saul. Verse number 7. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley with those who were beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in them. Well, that night, after the death of Saul, the villagers in all the battle area in the territory of Issachar abandoned their homes, and the Philistines came in and took shelter that night in their homes to live. Now the following day, the Philistines exited the homes that they had confiscated and lived in that night before going out to take the spoils from the dead. They found Saul and his son. The display of Saul occurs here in verse number 8. And it came about on the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. They put his weapons in the Temple of Asteroth, and they fastened his body to the wall at Beth Shean. Saul's head was cut off and sent throughout the land of the Philistines as a trophy. It probably circulated in the newly captured villages of Issachar first, before making its 3-day journey back to the Gaza Strip for the show and tell, we might call it. Saul's weapons landed in the Temple of Asteroth. You should recognize that name because she was the moon god whose symbol was the crescent moon seen on all Muslim flags. She was also the fertility goddess associated with rabbits and eggs. A variation on her name was Ashtar, which was later used in association with Ishtar or Easter. Her temple was in the Philistine city of Ashkelon, and it was the Temple of Venus, which was also known as Ashtar or Ashtaroth. The headless body of Saul was nailed to the wall at Beth Shean. Actually, the bodies of Saul's sons were nailed there too, but we're not told that yet. Beth Shean was not far from Mount Gilboa. It sat about 5 miles from the Jordan River, just past the flood line where the Jordan would leave its banks every year. It was on the major trade route from Jerusalem to Damascus. Many years later, the Apostle Paul, or Saul, would take the same route on his way to go to persecute the Christians in Damascus. Beth Shean sat where the Jezreel Valley ended at the Jordan River Valley, about 12 miles south of the Sea of Kinnereth, or what we call the Sea of Galilee today. To put it in perspective, all of this happened while David and his men were on their second day of the 3-day journey home from Jezreel back to Ziklag. There they will find their town burned and their families are gone, but they've still got another day to get there, and Saul has died the day before. In the compiler's last entry in this book, he leaves us with the good deed of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead and the burial of Saul and his sons. Verse number 11. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall at Bethshean, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. That means they didn't eat for 7 days. Now it is fitting that the Jabesh Gileads did this for Saul and his son. After all, they were the real reason the men asked Samuel for a king 40 years before, if you remember. You remember that in chapter 8 that the men came to Samuel and asked for a king with the excuse that Samuel was getting old and his priestly sons were worthless and wicked. Saul was selected and anointed king, but not really considered the king until Nahash the Amorite came to take over the main city in East Manasseh known as Jabesh Gilead. The city elders sent word over to all the nations for help instead of to King Saul, and when King Saul heard of it, it made him angry, and that he had been bypassed in the request because he was the king. Saul killed his 2 oxen that he'd been plowing with, and he sent pieces to the land, throughout the land, with the warning that anyone who could fight and did not come to fight, the same outcome would come to them. They would be cut up into pieces. Well, with the warning, all the men came, and they met at Mizpah in Gilead, which is not far from Jabesh Gilead, and not far from where Nahash was. And when the battle was over, Samuel revealed why the men wanted a king like all the surrounding nations. And he said this: when you saw that Nahash the king of the sons of Ammon came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, although the Lord your God was king. The first reason the men gave Samuel for a king was a lie. Samuel just bided his time, anointed Saul as king, and waited. Then Samuel told them the real reason they wanted a king. They wanted a king who could defeat Nahash and his Ammonite army. the men of Jabesh Gilead started the desire for a king in Israel, and now 40 years later, they owed it to the dead king. It's been 40 years. They owed it to the dead king Saul to recover and bury his body and those of his sons. At least they thought so. And the bodies had been dead for more than 2 days by this time in the heat, and the Hebrews were accustomed to burying before sunset on the day of the death. It was not the custom to burn the bodies. Yet the men of Jabesh Gilead burned their bodies, but not to ashes, for the bones were buried under the tree. The despair of the Jabesh Gileads for Saul and his sons was great. For the writer tells us that they could not eat for 7 days. That is what fasting means. It means not eating. In the Scripture, it is always associated with grief, great grief, with anxiety and or death. It is never something that is done to worship the Lord, although it is used in the worship of every false god and every false religion in the world. Even the Apostle Paul will stop the sailors from fasting to their false gods by saying and encouraging them to eat. Later to the Corinthians, he will say, food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. However, God will do away with both of them. Fasting just means not eating at that time. The Israelites learned fasting in Egypt, which was part of pagan worship. But the Israelites did not allow Egypt to get out of them when they got out of Egypt. Almost all of the struggles of idolatry, sin that they learned over in Egypt, fasting was one of them. They brought along with them, and it will be to their downfall throughout the rest of their time. And so we come to the end of the book of 1 Samuel. Yet, it is not the end of the story. We must quickly move on to the book of 2 Samuel for the rest of the story of Saul and David. It will pick up where chapter 30 left off, and truly it is a terrible book break. Samuel, when we call it 2 Samuel, Samuel has been dead for a long time. 2 years at least, maybe 4. And he writes nothing in the book of 2 Samuel, but because it's part of the story of David and Saul, and Samuel had parts of their lives, for some reason the compilers of our newer English versions call it 2 Samuel, where just 300 years ago it was called 2 Kings instead of 2 Samuel's. And you're going, wait a minute, we have a 2 Kings. Yes, for 300 years ago it was 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 3 Kings, and 4 Kings. Well, as we pick up here in 2 Samuel, it will pick up where chapter 30 left off, and David will have been in Ziklag for 2 days, when a messenger will bring the news of Saul's death. And by this time, Saul's bones have already been burned and buried underneath the tree at Jabesh Gilead, but not for long. David will see to that. In fact, in 1 Chronicles 10, it fills in some of the information about what happened on Saul's last day. Let's pick that up and let's just catch that too, so we have a complete look at this. It says, now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to taunt me and torture me. But the armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his sword and died. So Saul and his 3 sons died there together, bringing his dynasty to an end. When all the Israelites in the Jezreel Valley saw that their army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. So they stripped off Saul's armor and cut off his head. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death before their idols and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of their gods, and they fastened his head to the temple of Dagon. But when everyone in Jabesh-Gilead heard about everything the Philistines had done to Saul, all the mighty warriors brought the bodies of Saul and his son back to Jabesh. Then they buried their bones underneath the great tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He failed to obey the Lord's command, and he even consulted a medium instead of asking the Lord for guidance. So the Lord killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse. Turning to that first chapter of 1 Samuel, here's some things we discover. We discover that 3 days after returning to Ziklag with the families, a soldier from Saul's camp arrived to give David the news of the death of Saul and his sons. The writer tells us that David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so also did all the men who were with him, and they mourned and they wept, not eating until the day was done. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. And David wrote a song that day and instructed the sons of Judah to play the harp with the bow while singing. And here is that song. Your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. You have the mighty fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Askelon. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. O mountains of Gilboa, let not dew or rain be on you, nor fields of offerings. For their shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the word of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How have the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan is slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more powerful than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 19 through 27. No doubt from David's song, he was grieved over the deaths of Jonathan and Saul. However, what comes through in this song really deals with Saul and how David's heart truly felt about Saul. Saul had not been good to David, yet David respected Saul's position as the Lord's anointed king of Israel. Notice that in the song, David said about Saul, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life. That attitude can hardly sum up the testimony of the witness concerning Saul's attitude towards David. Yet, it does. It does sum up the testimony of David's attitude towards Saul. David never wished ill to come to Saul, the anointed king of Israel. David's constant saying was, "Thou shalt not touch the Lord's anointed." He even said it to the soldier who came to deliver the news to David and took the credit for ending Saul's life after he was mortally wounded. For that, David killed that soldier because he dared even profess that he touched the Lord's anointed. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. From Ziklag, David, with all his family and followers, journeyed on over to Hebron, where the Lord told him to go, audibly told him to go, where the tribe of Judah made him their king. And in the rest of the promised land, the other 11 tribes made Ishbosheth, Saul's only living son, their king. But that caused the divided kingdom in Israel, and also brought civil war between 11 tribes and one tribe of Judah in the promised land. We will learn about that in our study of 2 Samuel. What have we learned here in this study? More than anything, we have learned why Samuel said to Saul long before his death, "The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. The man after God's own heart was David. He truly had the heart of the Lord within him. With all of David's sins, and may I say to you, he had many sins. We know that from how he had lied to the priest at Nob, and 85 men were killed. How he had lied to the king of Gath. Many sins, many sins. Still, David's heart was in tune with the Lord. You might have heard me say in some of my other lessons, David was probably one of the greatest sinners in the world. But in my mind, he was also probably one of the greatest repenters in the world. And because of the way David repented, we have much to learn from David in 2 Samuel. Unlike Saul, David's heart will not change as the days pass in his life. Oh, Saul was pretty good to begin with, but as the days passed in his life, he became worse and worse and worse. And so we should look to David to be an example for all of us to follow. Oh, we're going to see David sin. We're going to see him fall in many sins. But we're also going to see how he repents and how he relies on the Lord. And we should seek to have the heart of the Lord every moment of every day that we live. Remember from the testimony at the end of this book of 1 Samuel that David was constantly calling for the priest to come to wear the ephod and to ask the Lord properly and correctly, Lord, what is your will for me? Shall I stay? Shall I go? Shall I sit? Shall I act? Shall I run? Shall I stand? Should I go here? Should I go here? Where should I go? And even in 2 Samuel, while he's there at Ziklag, he brings the priest Abiathar in and with the ephod, and he says, let's ask the Lord, Lord, should I stay here in Ziklag, or should I go to Hebron, or should I go someplace else? And the Lord always answers him, and he says, go to Hebron. And there the people and the leaders of Judah crown him as king. David earnestly would seek to have the heart of God in everything. And all through the Psalms that we have read through this study, and there have been many already that I've read to you, the songs that David wrote at different points in his life of dealing with Saul and all the surroundings. David was constantly, because of his music and his writing of these songs, looking to God. And these songs are actually in many ways prayers to the Lord. Prayers. Prayers are to be sung by the people with the choir director leading the people so that we can remember how David's heart was. A heart made after the heart of God. David, whose heart was like God. I want to tell you this as we end this book. It is my pleasure to study constantly the Word of God, seeking the heart of God. That's what I get to do. But you need to do that too. Will you earnestly seek to have the heart of God also? Will you earnestly seek to have the heart of God starting today, at this very moment? For you see, when you have the heart of God, no matter what comes your way, No matter what lies were told about David, God revenged David. No matter what was said to him about what the Lord wanted him to do and the Lord didn't want him to do by the people who didn't even hear from the Lord, David heard from the Lord, and he would not touch the Lord's anointed. He would not take it upon himself to do anything that the Lord would not direct him to do when he inquired of the Lord, and he sought the Lord, and he sought the Lord's heart. And the Lord took care of David. David is not going to be killed in battle. David is going to die a natural death 40 years after this. He's 30 years old at this point. He is 30 years old. He has 3 wives. He doesn't have any children yet. But they will come. They will come quickly when he moves back to Hebron. And he will also have more wives that will come, more concubines. 40 years from this point, with the start of 1 Kings, we'll find out that Bathsheba will come to David and said, "Isn't Solomon supposed to be the king who takes your place?" And we will read on and we'll see how David, laying on his bed, dying, will resign as king of Israel and have Solomon anointed as king, place him on his mule and ride him through the streets in his coronation parade. And David, when Solomon comes in to see David on his deathbed, which by the way, he will not die for a couple of years after that happens, David will bow to him as king, the new king on his bed. The heart of God. The heart of God. Will you earnestly seek to have the heart of God also, starting today?